It's impossible to imagine our world without cars. Despite the fact that a car is just a pile of metal and a set of spare parts, no one thinks like that. Many people believe that a car possesses a soul. It's like a real family member. And some people prioritize their personal car above themselves and even above their family. Pretty often we only have to take a look at the car to understand everything about its owner. We don't even have to converse. Everything is clear. And obviously not all cars are created right and equal. If you drive a Renault Logan, you would hardly be permitted to pass other cars as in a Geländewagen. Although some old Geländewagen would cost as much as a new Logan, still they would let it pass by more often. Could it be, I wonder, that a car might be a real problem for its owner? Not the story where your DCG breaks for the second time in a week. Could the owner be gradually beaten down for having a car of the wrong brand? Could someone perhaps even murder a man for his car choice? It sounds absolutely crazy. Today, if you'd come for a Peugeot club meeting and began yelling that a Peugeot was shit, the worst consequence would be beauty bags thrown at you. I know what I'm talking about, but the thing is that we have those examples in human history. And today, from this video, you'll know how and why the cult surrounding the car was born, how cars makers shot their workers down and the workers demolished their manufacturers, how one worker from the Ford factory arrived here to the USSR, and how this trip changed the course of car history, what people were willing to do when an empire built in cars was crashing. You will witness an interesting, though detailed and eventful, story of Detroit, the most important city of the car industry. Enjoy the video. Of course, when Detroit was originally founded, no one could predict anything about it becoming a car empire. First of all, Detroit belonged to Canada and was a trading settlement. Just a piece of land enclosed by a fence trading fur skins with Native American Indians. Fur skins have four-wheel covers. The natives couldn't drive without them. Every native had to have them for sure. Before the 19th century, there was only about 1,000 Europeans. The black slaves and the natives were not regarded human, hence the information only about white people. 1,000 people lived there. And when we speak about that period, it was quite a large settlement, but still only a settlement, a camp with a fence. And at some point that village burned down in 1805 and the property development began. They built shipyards and the first manufacturers. And that's what Detroit looked like 100 years later in 1905. But it would start to become more significant on the 5th August 1899, when DAC was founded, Detroit Automobile Company. That was the very first U.S. car company in Detroit. It was founded by the infamous Henry Ford, certainly. Chapter 1. Henry Ford. The Ford wasn't his first company. He gathered 12 investors, and then DAC was the first car company he founded. Do you remember that famous legend where Ford in his barn put together some wagon with some engine? That was before he opened DAC. Ford had many ideas, but no money. He was just a regular mechanic. And with this wagon, he came and convinced 12 investors, the mayor of the town included, to invest $86,000. If we talk about modern money, it's $2.6 million bucks. A large amount of money for sure, yes? And the focus of the DAC activities was a vehicle for deliverymen. It was slow, heavy, uncomfortable, also very hard to build. The idea was void from the start in principle. There were only 12 ever produced, the money was wasted. Ford, who was very pleased, left the company and founded his own Ford company in 1903. A year later, in 1905, he founded the Ford Piquet plant. That was the very first full-fledged car factory in Detroit. Ford is the first element in our diagram. It's the cornerstone, the first foundation of Detroit's future. The next moment was in 1904. A man named William Durant bought a huge chunk of Buick shares. Chapter 2. William Durant. Buick had already existed by that time. A successful brand, it wasn't located in Detroit, but it was a successful car company. Durant wasn't as famous as Henry Ford, although a few years later he created a brand you definitely heard about. It was such a small, low-profile company, General Motors. Durant wasn't an inventor, he was an entrepreneur. He was trying to sell things since he was a little kid. Cigarettes, papers, shoes, then all of that came to real estate. And so, as a result of his upbringing was the fact that in 1986 he had his own factory which produced running gear for bullock carts. He produced wagon wheels, so to speak. And actually, his mindset predetermined all the way of General Motors' development and of the whole car industry. Perhaps I'll say something not obvious to you, but GM has never been a car producer. GM is just a managing company. And the car producers were Chevrolet, Opel, GMC, Cadillac, the very same Buick, yeah. And GM was just an office with managers and stuff. When Durant began to manage the Buick, the company was doing poorly. They were just producing something within some scope and they were not highly regarded. But within 4 years, Durant made Buick to an industry leader, and in 1908, Buick was a bestseller car brand. Although Ford Model T was also born in 1908, it didn't manage to move his competitor yet. The main difference between Durant's and Ford's business models was the following. Ford placed all his bets on one model, and Durant decided that each manufacturer had to have a wide range of products so that each customer could find something fitting exactly for them. I must say that in 1900s that wasn't common practice at all. Actually, those men both were right in their own way. Ford's legacy is the conveyor belt method of car manufacturing and the fact that all producers put their cars together like this. And Durant's legacy was the business model, and the most modern companies and dealers work by the patterns which were invented by Durant. That's why he's just as significant for car industry as Henry Ford himself. And so it was 1908, and Buick was sitting pretty. Durant founded the company General Motors. He gave all his shares and all the control to it, invited a bunch of investors, and began to buy everything that moves and everything he saw at all. Oldsmobile, Cadillac, Oakland, our modern Pontiac, rapid motor vehicle, our GMC truck in modern world. Beside car producers, GM began to buy all manufacturers of components and everything that was somehow connected to the car industry. They even almost bought Ford at the time, since 1908 till 09, but investors didn't approve the deal. Actually, they thought it would be too risky to be monopolist in every corner. Some problems with government, and so they decided that Ford may live peacefully and put together his cars. But those politics didn't earn huge profit because GM still had less sales than Ford. Shareholders and investors wanted their dividends for invested money, but Durant was spending all the profit by buying more and more new companies. That's why shareholders and investors were resented. At some point they gathered together, they pondered, and they just bought all Durant's shares and threw him out of the company. It was in 1910. But Durant wasn't upset. He took the mustached racer Louis Chevrolet to found, oh my god, how unexpected, Chevrolet. And actually in this company they decided to focus on the public sector, on inexpensive cars of high quality to move into Ford Model T's consumer section. And they made it! Chevrolet began to evolve very fast by taking market sectors for itself, and Durant was sitting pretty again. Well, being a clever wheeler dealer, he began to change Chevrolet's shares for GMS. Sold them here, bought them there, and there he was on the GM board again. Plus, he borrowed more money from investors, bought out everything that was left in GM. And by using every piece of the company's money, he began to buy everything he could, just like that, systematically. But in the year 1920, the car sales significantly fell down, and if you would attack the market like Durant, it could just literally threaten the company. Because suddenly you could have some huge financial holes. Something would absorb something, game over. All investors gathered once again, pondered once again, did the math, and they decided that they didn't need to run again. And at that point, they threw him out of the company for good. But as you can see, GM still exists today and had become the second backbone, cornerstone, concrete bay foundation of Detroit's future, and that's why it appears on our list here. While Durant and Chevrolet were tinkering their products in garage in 1911, some fellow named Walter Percy came to Buick and his surname would become a household name. Chrysler. He came to work as a production manager for Buick cars. Chapter 3. Walter Chrysler. By the way, Chrysler was a fascinating man. He knew his way around his age-cutting tech. He loved the manufacturing process, and thanks to his talents, he was a really talented man. By the age of 30, he already took a position as a general manager of American Locomotive Company. It was the largest railway company in the USA at that time. And there is a very interesting legend that Chrysler had been working upward his whole life. He went from a janitor up to the board member of that railway company, and it's true actually, his first position was low and he could have never afforded a car for himself, but he dreamed of it, and as soon as he was a general manager, he finally bought a car. He admired it so much, he took it apart and put it back together in his garage, yet he didn't know how to drive, and he decided my life would be connected only with vehicles, like I'm gonna make them, that's it, bye bye bye. But it was really even more prosaic in truth. There was an investment banker in the board, James J. Storrow. He noticed the young manager who moved up through the ranks of the American Railway Corporation very fast. And he said, okay, maybe we should really hunt this guy. He's a cool dude, I think. And then actually he and Buick's president Charles Nash came to Chrysler and said, bro, come work with us. We won't pay you enough, but we have a very interesting job. We'll give you the production line, you'll fix it, and then we'll see. And the most surprising thing was Chrysler saying yes. His wage was really minimal, $6,000 a year. Well, for his position at that time, it was what? It was shockingly cheap, but perhaps those guys gave him a pretty picture of the process he would impact. That's why he was very happy to agree. They simply pursued him. Perhaps he really even admired some car, took it to pieces, and etc., but they pursued him. In fact, Chrysler distinguished himself as the best. After 4 years, he reorganized the manufacturing line so that they were producing not just 20 cars a day, but rather 550. Think about it. Such a rate of expansion in 1920. During that time, Durant returned to the board. He saw the talented manager and offered him a vice president position. Of course, Chrysler agreed, but he'd been holding it for 4 years, that's all. During those 4 years of work, he and Durant had many disagreements because those guys had different approaches to business operations. In 1920, because of disagreements with Durant, Chrysler left to, guess what? To find Chrysler. What a way to name something so very original, yeah. No one thought about it before, to name a company after its surname. Holy cow. But it was not so simple, really. It was the 1920s. The time of the garage self-learners had passed. You couldn't just start a car company from scratch. You needed resources, facilities, manufacturers, money, and blah blah blah. Ford was already blazing away. The GM was blazing away. The market was competitive and busy. Actually, it's not fully clear if Chrysler left with the thought that he had to start his company, or if he just left GM. Because after GM, he went to work as a manager at Willys Overland. Or rather, he didn't ask to, but Willys' board invited him to heal their pain in the ass. The company was on its knees, everything was bad. They had invested a ton of money, but the result was bleeding money. They called Chrysler in order to fix the situation. By the way, they offered him annually $1 million. It's still a huge sum. Imagine it for a minute. In the 1920s, it was astronomical, some limitless wealth. You couldn't spend all of it in a lifetime, you should stop. For a year, and his contract was for 2 years. Well, like, Chrysler made a lot of money. When he left GM, he had about $10 million in his personal account. I remind you, originally the man came for a manager position, making $6,000 a year. Just so you know that Chrysler knew how to make bank. Chrysler worked in Willys for 2 years, and then he saw another company named Maxwell Motors that was also dying at that time. Here is an interesting fact. Maxwell Motors was the very first company in history of the whole car making that decided to market their cars for women. In the year 1920, women were treated poorly back then. People were wondering if women were equal humans, if they could have a right to vote, or if they should wash dishes, and Maxwell thought, we'll make cars for them. Like, it's not clear if they're humans or not, but they said, okay, alright. And in the year 1909, they sponsored Alice Ramsey, a female driver. She drove through all the states from shore to shore in a Maxwell car. There was an impossible amount of hype. All the media were writing about it, discussing, look here, a woman whose driver, holy cow! But the sales were poorly, and those fellas kinda missed the fact that though women were maybe humans, it's possible, but they hadn't any money. Men were with money. Men didn't want cars designed for women. So Maxwell had no sales. But Chrysler said, to hell with women, I shall make cars for normal men. But there was a problem. Maxwell was a pretty large company. They couldn't come just like that, throw everything out and remake everything. Chrysler had to reorganize everything for 3 years. And after 3 years, Maxwell Company officially ceased to exist. The Chrysler Company was born from its ashes using its facilities. It quickly took off, almost immediately. They launched 2 additional brands, Pontiac and DeSoto. And then they bought another company with an impossibly creative name from the Dodge brothers, the Dodge Company. Or rather, Chrysler bought the company from their family, because in 1920, pneumonia suddenly was a lethal disease. The Dodge brothers died as its victims. Pneumonia was the sole cause of death, and today you could just swallow some pills and be alright. Back then, welcome to the grave. But don't tell it to anti-vaxxers. Chrysler was lucky and excited. In 1928, he was called the Man of the Year around America. And do you remember, I know that you remember, I believe you saw that cartoon, Spider-Man. Do you remember it from your childhood? I'll remind you, there was a man, a villain, I guess his name was Tusk. He was big and square and a giant skyscraper. So that was the Chrysler building, and Chrysler built it. Can you just imagine how rich that guy was? In our times, 100 years later, it's one of the most significant buildings in America. And it was not like renting a Lamborghini and making photos like you're so successful. He built a skyscraper for lack of anything better to do. He didn't need a skyscraper. Let's build this giant for no reason. And so, nevertheless, Chrysler Corporation and Walter Percy Chrysler are our third cornerstone of Detroit future. And just like that, we come to the 1930s. All the top brands, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, were in Detroit. Their manufacturers were there. They were working full speed, money came from everywhere. Just imagine the most successful car industry in the world at that time. All the main manufacturers were in one place. And beside the car manufacturers, there were also a concentration of all the companies that supply the car industries, like paints, oils, wheels, and so on. Now we have to take a step aside from cars, so we could see the whole picture. I need to give you a bit of context about Detroit, or else what, did I waste 3 weeks in English sources for nothing? Or American ones? I'm gonna tell you everything. Chapter 4. Detroit in 20s and 30s. Detroit became the 4th city in the US by population. And because it was merely industrial, no Nobel Prize winners were gathering there, but unskilled workers, mainly black ones. Add to that Ford's politics. He paid his workers much more than market prices, and he promised to pay everyone much more than market prices, and he paid. Really, worker wages in Ford factories were the highest ones. Detroit became the center of the Great Migration. It's the process in the US in the 20th 30s when all the agricultural South was leaving to the industrial North. First, because the white Southern population treated black people inferiorly and used violence without any doubt. Second, it was better working in the North in the factory plants and earning money than sitting in the South in the field and earning a bullet in your ass.
I don't know what this nigga you like.
It's all right. It's all right.
Plus, white people who had their black workers, servants, and etc., they were leaving to North, all the same because of the growth perspective. Of course, they brought many with them. Now it's gonna be a bit difficult, but hang on. And try to hold the picture in your mind. The overall majority of the population were unskilled workers, mostly black ones, immigrants from other countries, Jewish people, high for it, and the top management, white people who were making money on all those people. They didn't have much respect to each other, and that's why in 1920 in Detroit they opened a branch office of the non-for-profit organization that was called Ku Klux Klan. It originated from the South, but then, together with the Great Migration, it spread out across all the country. The main idea of that organization was in no way allowing equality between white people and black people and saving the country from black invasion. Their activity resulted in hundreds of thousands killed. The main swing of their terror occurred in the first half of the 20th century. During their peak years, in the 20s, they accounted for 6 million people. And even today, in the 21st century, Ku Klux Klan still exists. Going further, and add to this company the prohibition that was in force since 1920 till 1933. Here, I should tell you a little about Detroit's location, because it was and it is located on the Canadian border. There is the Detroit River, and naturally, of course, it was the main center and the major unit of alcohol contrabanding during the years of prohibition. And who could smuggle booze? Right, you are peace-loving guys with Tommy guns. By the way, did some of you play the old video game Gangsters 2, huh? It's very ancient, blood flows out of your eyes when you look at the graphics, but still one of my favorite childhood games, and it tells you about this era. If you didn't play it and you're ready to suffer that graphics, I advise it to you. Let's gather those things together. Imagine that growing operation, the flow of black people greeted near the city by peace-loving guys in white hoods, bootleggers with machine guns constantly driving across the city, and all this time up there, the very top of top managers sitting and throwing money just like that, because they really had a shit ton of money, and when we put it all together, we have very friendly, welcoming vibes of large, involving industry city as a result. The icing on the cake was the market crash in 1929, when a pretty huge amount of smart and not so smart people went for a walk out of the window. According to the official statistics only, to the official data, there were 3 or 4 people killing themselves a day in Detroit. If anything, it's a large number. The average citizen of Detroit at that time was a black unskilled worker who was hiding in back streets in order not to be caught by a dude in the white hood, drunk gangsters with Tommy guys in cars crossing his way all the time, people falling from the windows to death, and just like that, you're going to work. Production declined very much during the Great Depression, which was logical. Of course, factories had to fire people in bunches because they couldn't pay them and they couldn't produce without demand. Chapter 5: Hunger March. The result of all this was the Hunger March of the 7th of March 1932. The media called it the bloodiest day in the history of car making. The most participants were from Ford plant. Of course, we could tell about the fact that the Communist Party had always supported unrest among the workers, and agitators were always there, and those guys believed that a world of equals was possible, and so on. But my interest lies with cars only, nothing else, no politics, and if we would pull the politics into all of this, we wouldn't finish this video until Sunday. Although it's Monday. The media was also filled with headlines screaming about the Ford massacre, as if Ford himself organized it. What was it? I'll explain. 5,000 people gathered. They wrote 14 demands, really standard ones like to hire everybody back, to raise salaries, to kill racial discrimination, peace, friendship, cookies, and so on. But the interesting thing for us is that was the first day when there was a demand to give workers the right to organize unions. Why it's important, you'll find out later. But in 1932, instead of fulfilling their demands, those workers got another answer: bullets. If you would read original paper articles of those times, and I really did it while getting ready for this video, they described an exceptionally peaceful demonstration that was first going across the city, then they decided to go to the plant, they marched up to the fence of the Ford plant, and police and security met them there. First there was tear gas, then batons, then someone shot in the air, and then at people. As a result, 60 workers and 25 policemen were wounded, and 5 workers died after that march during 3 months. Whether we should believe the press, I don't know. Well, from one hand, yes, it's a terrible thing to shoot up some peaceful demonstration, unacceptable in any way. From the other hand, I personally don't believe that 5,000 workers, fired and hungry, who were standing in freezing cold all day, were going to the factory to drink some tea. I doubt it very much. I sincerely am, because the factory is a private property, it's untouchable and so on, and it's a very strong rule in the USA even now. If you would trespass, you could get killed. Seriously, with a gun. And no one would even say anything. And back then, morals were even harder, and I think basically police and security just did their job at that moment. Most likely. But I don't argue that it was the most bloody day in the history of car making, of course. Also, I could say, following in the defense of Ford, at the moment he paid actually the biggest salaries in all the industry. In the year 1929, it was something about $1,600 per month. It's a pretty normal sum of money now. You could bust your ass for it, and back then, even several families could live on this kind of money. It was enough for one man to work like that to support his family. And the salaries went down at the time of the Great Depression, but still they amounted up to $700–800, and that too was pretty sum. Anyway, the most important thing to remember is the fact of the first demand to build unions. They would pay their part. Let's get back to Detroit. After any economic jam, even the biggest and scariest one, the country would go through a very fast boom. And in 1935 too, when the economy chilled out, Detroit started to launch itself up to space. People began to rush in Detroit with an incredible speed, I tell you. Here's a bit of the official statistics for you, some official numbers that don't need even to be commented. Between 1930 and 1950, 300,000 people came into the city. And at the same time, there were no computers. There was no normal documentation. And these are the official data only. I think the real scale was even bigger. And beside the expected economical growth, there is an explanation to this new wave of migration. A certain event began, which would bring some really fabulous money to Americans. And Detroit would be the world center of industry and manufacture. World War II. Chapter 6. World War II. As we all know, the victors in the war were our famous mustache dude, the British famous fat dude, and the American who knows who is it. America was lucky because there was absolutely no fighting on their territory. All the commotion was in our country, in Europe and in Japan, well, in general. And Americans just produced military hardware, supplied their army, supplied the allies. They produced everything they needed and made some really incredible money off all that. There were no civilian cars producing in the US at that time. Every manufacturer was working at the war machine. We all know heroic deeds of our grandparents. We know how mobilized the USSR was. Absolutely every plant and facility were producing everything necessary for the front. Weapons, hardware, ammunition. All our country was working hard. And now look at the numbers. This is the GDP in billions of dollars during the war. Why am I showing you this? I don't want to diminish great deeds of our ancestors and the USSR's role in the war. You just need to understand the scale of the US war machine at that time. Look at 1942, 43, 44, 45. The USA produced military hardware way more than us. And naturally, the center of all that was Detroit. Here's an example for you. During the war, within impossible deadlines, the Willow Run plant was built to produce the heavy bomber B-24. It was 45 kilometers from Detroit, and Ford owned it. 42,000 workplaces, 3,500 hectares of space, and a 1.5 kilometers long assembly line. Ford knew something about the line assembly, I must say, and that's why one heavy bumper left the assembly line on that plant in an hour. That damn thing was 25 tons. It was put together from scratch from a set of bolts and nuts in the whole bumper in 60 minutes. Chrysler didn't go tits up and produced tanks, self-propelled carriers, and all of that. He was working for the Detroit Arsenal. If you're interested, Google it. But that's a fact. Hear this. During the war, Chrysler put together 90,000 combat units. That is, tanks and self-propelled carriers. No, not like that. All the USSR during the war, including tanks, carriers, and everything, it produced 95,500 combat units. And Chrysler only 90,000. That's more clear, I think. They weren't being bombed, nothing. They were just producing war hardware and they were making money off it, that's it. And after the war, they too were victors and they got war reparations, territories, plants, equipment, everything they could take from the lost countries. They could take it all to the US just like that. Long story short, they had a shit ton of money. And exactly that was the reason of what we call today the golden age of car making. The 1950s. Chapter 7. The Fat 50s. When I hear the words the American vehicle, I imagine not the modern shit like that, for example, but cars from the 1950s, 60s, children of Detroit. Buick Roadmaster, Cadillac Series 62 since Generation 4, incredibly crazy Chrysler Town & Country, Chevrolet Bel Air, Chevrolet Impala, Chevrolet Del Rey, Cadillac DeVille, Ford Del Rio, F-Series for the first generation. Just look at that, just look what a trap! Ford Thunderbird, and of course Ford Mustang, Dodge Charger, Chevrolet Camaro. And so on, there were just super-pooper jillions of those vehicles. And gas costed like water. Everything that was less than V8 for 5 liters wasn't regarded as a car, and at that time cars had a 3-year production cycle. Today, each model from each big producer has a 7-year production cycle. Like you produce a car, it has a restyling 3 years later, and a new model. Back then it was 3 years, and it was a standard no one was allowed to violate. You couldn't keep up with your competition if you'd be so slow. People bought off everything. It was crazy. That Cadillac Series 62 was changing every year. Every year it was changing either its look, or its motor, or both. And right now, right in October, we have a very hot meme again that all the losers have last year iPhones, gadgets for $100. And back then, the same was with vehicles. If you had a last year Cadillac Series 62, you were a loser, bye-bye. That were vehicles for $10,000, not some ridiculous phone. For example, Chrysler had a campaign where they proudly declared that their cars were the most fuel-hungry cars in the world. And they were wanted because of that. They sucked gas like nobody's business and people wanted those cars for themselves because they were super cool. We can't understand that with our modern brain. How was it? 40 liters? Cool! Nice! I'll take it. 35? You're a dork. I have a 40, real deal. What? Exactly at that time, the vehicle cult was born. Exactly at that time, the image was born every one of us dreamed of. A highway running over the horizon. You're at the wheel of a 20-feet coupe. You have a V8 under the hood and you're driving, just driving. That was the moment that cool was born. And if this image for us is a dream that would never come true, back then, people lived like that. They had everything. They had great 20-feet coupe, giant, impossible engines, and those highways running over the horizon. In the 1940s, 1950s, all the arterial roads were being built through all these states. They even wrote songs about cars. For example, Dina Shore was singing that you should have a road trip in your Chevrolet as soon as possible.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. The Rockies way out west are calling you.
Oh, it's a honey, get in the know. This new Chevy has go, 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 go.
Life is completer in a Chevy.
Life is amazing in the Chevy. Yeah, of course. She didn't sit in the modern cruise. At that time, everywhere car clubs started to grow. And if Ford Model T gave people an opportunity to have a vehicle, then cars of the 1950s gave people a chance to fall in love with them. They spoke about vehicles. They dreamed of them. The whole way of life was just built around them. In 1945, the Americans had 25 million vehicles. In 55, their amount was 52 millions. The motor park doubled surely in 10 years. And vehicles were like drugs, to population. And Detroit was their dealer that was constantly giving those people new fixes. But while top managers of Ford, GM, and Chrysler were basking in their success and rolling in clover, the situation began to change. All of that magnificence in general, and Detroit in particular, were finished by a large coincidence of factors that were really independent, as it usually is. All young people that were born in the 1950s or the late 40s and were growing up during that insanity, who were between 17 and 20, began to propagandize and foster polar opposite values. One of the mass cultures in the modern world was being born: hippies. They wanted to gain some enlightenment and nirvana by meditations, cannabis, alcohol, guitar by the fire, and so on and so forth. And as you can guess, the list of those values didn't include a V8 at all. Plus, hippies thought that the best way of living were communes. Like a common territory, everything is common, nothing belongs to anyone, everyone shares with each other, and according to that concept, it was pretty weird to have your own car. And so they didn't dream about their own new Cadillac, never ever. And what did the senior staff of the Big Three do? That's right, they didn't care. They thought those students would smoke, drink, fuck, but then they'd move on, find normal jobs, and they would finally buy their new product. The new V8, everything would be fine, no problem. Waiter, more champagne. And so, in 1956, when everyone was rich, sales were growing, a point of no return happened. Without any war declaration, the Packard factory closed. Not Hewlett-Packard with printers, but just Packard, a car maker. I didn't tell about it earlier on purpose to save it for last for those who didn't fall asleep and who endure till this moment. Packard was the American Rolls-Royce. The company was founded in 1899, but essentially it was like the American Rolls-Royce. And guess the surname of the founder of this company? Correct, Packard. And his name was James Ward. Then 1928. Packard was a top performer in manufacturing of high-end vehicles in the USA. Those vehicles were even delivered to the Soviet Union en masse. Oh wait, what's Soviet Union? We had communism, equality, and shit like this. No one had any money, right? Yeah. Packards were bought for state institutions, and for people, a simple car in general was some event like a box rides by itself. Oh shit, they didn't understand it was high-end. Simple cars were like wonders. A new model of ZAZ Zaporozhets, that's all. More than half of states' motor parks were represented with Packards. Beside that, equality, communism, and cookies. There's even a legend that some Packard's parts were used for designing the first Soviet car ZS-110, but we'll look at this legend sometime later. That's a very freaking long story too. But during the Great Depression, Packard was feeling really bad because they produced only high-end cars and nothing else. Their demand fell to the bottom. And if the Big Three had an option to offer something cheaper and so on, and they survived because of those sales, Packard had nothing to offer. That's why they decided to move over to this sector of cheaper cars. And in that sector during the following 20 years, they were losing the competition with the big three year after year because those had more experience and resources. Packard started the brand dilution and began to lose their original clients. Today, if Rolls-Royce would make a new model based on Toyota Corolla, it would be the last days for Rolls-Royce. It's obvious now, but it wasn't obvious for Packard in the 20s. In 1948, when all the car makers were chasing for an unreal cool look of their vehicles, Packard was producing the Model 23, which received a nickname given by people, Turned Over Bathtub. It was really a very strange car according to the design, and among others, it was real bullshit. And at that moment, when the company teetered on the edge of profitability, of sales, and all of that stuff, it was pushed to the abyss by its workers. Do you remember about unions? Chapter 8 UAW. Meet Walter Reuther. Strange as it is, there is particularly no information about this guy in the Runet. I found it personally a very big surprise that it wasn't possible to find something about him in Russian. You'll understand why. He was raised in the family of German immigrants, and his father was a bit of crazy socialist. He always burdened his children with questions like about equality, women's rights, communism, and other such stuff. As he was 19, Walter decided to leave his father's house, and he came to work for the Ford plant. The funny fact is, in order to become a worker in Ford's plant, your minimum age had to be 25 years. But the shift foreman liked Walter very much, so he wrote in the documents that he was like almost 60 and hired him. Very quickly, Walter became the most highly paid employee on the Ford plant. Just because he could very well read checklists and normative documents really well. And as we can see, nothing has really changed in 100 years if we look at the modern Ford production. If you can read, you'd surely be the best worker of the month already, it's guaranteed. In 1927, when Walter was spending much time working at the Ford plant, something happened. They stopped producing Ford Model T, and Ford, a real manufacturer, wasn't used to throwing anything out. He sold the assembly line together with its workers to the USSR. Those workers' goal was very simple, to put together and adjust the assembly line. And yeah, our gas began with the Ford Model T assembly line. The first models ever produced by Gas were Gas A and Gas AA. Like better shit. Those were simply revamped and very badly composed Ford A and Ford AA. And so a bunch of workers, headed by Walter, because he was the only one who could read, were sent to organize production to US, and Walter was freaking shocked. It was minus 30 degrees, their barracks were unheated, the workers were living in unthinkable conditions, the top staff didn't know any shit about anything. No one was in control, no one took any responsibility, and no one knew how to manage anything. And as we remember about 15 years earlier, every man in the country who could manage or knew just a little something about production was executed by shooting, decliquized, and so on. Every day, Walter wrote letters to the press, to committees, so that somebody paid attention to how workers lived. Minus 30, no heat, nobody gave a shit. Welcome to Russia, what did you expect? And because Vitok, I think Walter got the name Vitok very quickly after he came to the Soviets, he had full insurance from Ford and a raging fire in his eyes. So he took a journey after he fulfilled his duties. He adjusted the assembly line for 2 years and took a journey on a bicycle. On a bicycle! Like that dude participated in launching a plant. Then they did it. He looked at the thing they put together and he was like, oh guys, screw it, I'll take a bicycle. That very reasonable traveler, once again on a freaking bicycle, made his way to Turkey, Iran, India, China. Somehow he managed to reach Japan after that. There he sailed as a blue coat, a sailorman, or some cargo ship going to the USA and returned back home. And then he discovered his brother right in the middle of building up a union. And because Walter had seen the hungry terrorists in the USSR with minus 30 temperatures and studied other workers' experience in foreign countries, he got enthusiastic over that idea. On that moment, he decided to devote himself to the fight for human rights. You'll get why I'm mocking him later. But There's his quote. All people long for the same basic human goals of a job with some degree of security, greater opportunity for their children, and of course, freedom. We felt we could make a contribution by helping American workers build strong and democratic labor unions. That's why we went into the labor movement. Why am I telling you about that dude? The result of his convulsive activity was UAW, United Automobile Workers. It's an American organization of unions, and up to date it still works, and it's called one of the main reasons of Detroit's fall from grace, among others. The very beginning of all that was really adequate. The first strike, or rather the first action, happened on the Kelsey Hayes plant, which supplied the Ford factory and its assembly line with brakes, shoes, and wheels. Walter and his brother convinced the workers to call a strike, to stop working. It was their answer to the top staff demanding a speed up of the assembly line. It is said that workers were constantly losing their fingers or even limbs during the process. Technically, the speed increase of the assembly line could just as likely increase the speed of losing fingers by workers. That's why they had to do a strike immediately and stop the production. Anyway, as a result, the workers agreed to stop working. The assembly line stopped, and they were joined by some regular people. Their friends and family, and so on. They blocked the entrances to the plant and prevented managers from entering. After 10 days of that activity, the top staff of Kelsey had to satisfy the workers' demands because Uncle Ford really needed that stuff. Those parts, those brake shoes and wheels, because he had another assembly line. Well, come on, huh? Well, if the main line stopped, it would hurt. And the result of that strike were following. The assembly line was slowed down, and the top staff didn't have the right to fire the strikers at all because they joined UAW. The plan negotiated with UAW. It was the condition for the strike to be finished. That was the most freaking stupid situation. You build manufacturers, you build a plant, you hire people to work with all the conditions they agreed to. You pay them salary, but at some point a veto comes, all this shuts down. You bear incredible losses, you make Ford himself seek for an additional supplier and therefore reduce your profit in the future. You slow the line down, but you still can fire those workers. Even if they would drink, be lazy, skip work, you can't fire them. Go talk to Vitok, and Vitok would decide if you could fire someone or not. After that event, UAW began to exist officially, and immediately it began to hit the top. At that moment, in 1936, the biggest manufacturer was GM. On the 31st of December, the year 1936, the largest sit-down strike on the GM plant in Flint began. It was a sit-down strike because the workers literally sat down on their asses in the facilities. Like the 31st, Happy New Year, we'll be sitting here. But the top staff didn't draw a blank and turned the heating off for the night. Like you guys could sit here and freeze, but because of communism, of ideas of communists, because of strikes and riots, and because of the example of the USSR in Europe and so on, it was very easy to startle the workers, and that is why the workers striking in Flint were supported by people from other plants. A few days later, workers at the Detroit's Fleetwood plant also sat down, and that plant was producing engines for Cadillac, and there was a chain reaction. Oakland, California, Pontiac, Michigan, St. Louis, Missouri, workers from all over the country supported those guys in Flint. As it usually was in situations like that, the police came and tried to disperse the protest, like, guys, perhaps you should go. Why are you sitting here? Families wait for you at home. But at some point, batons came into play, then bullets, 13 workers were wounded, but they didn't give the plant away. The mayor himself had to intervene with 2,000 members of the National Guard not to shoot everyone down, but to keep the peace, so that no one could kill each other because the fever pitch was... It was horrible. New Year, cold weather. No heating, the plant stopped, people sitting there was no good. But GM gave up only after the sit-down of the plant that was the only one producing engines for Chevrolet. Chevrolet was the most profit-generating brand at that moment, and the fate of the whole company depended on it. And when those workers sat down on their asses, James gave in. They had to agree to all the terms and sign all the documents with UAW. The strike lasted 44 days, and Roy, Walter's brother, after everything was done, he said, "When the boys came out of the plants, I never saw a night like that, and perhaps we'll never see it again. I liken to a country experiencing independence. Families reunited for the first time since the strike began, kids hanging on to daddy with tears of joy and happiness. It was a sea of humanity in which fears were no longer on the minds of the workers." After that strike, James signed an absolutely horrible, hellish document, Reuther's Treaty of Detroit. I won't translate it for you, but the most important part was, just think of it, it gave UAW the right and a seat in the board of the concern in exchange of a promise, no strikes for the whole 5 years. Just think of it. Walter and his brother Roy organized massive strikes in all of GM's plants, pressed out a light seat for themselves in the board of the concern. Do you think they left at that? No, of course. Already 4 weeks later, 60,000 Chrysler's workers sat down, and it also joined UAW with the same terms. The problem with the conveyor belt method is the strike being the most terrible thing to happen. Just imagine, all the parts, all the accessory parts on the whole assembly line are the products of other manufacturers with their own assembly lines. And if the main assembly line stops for a day, not to mention a month, it goes without saying all the systems go sideways. First, dealers don't get their vehicles. They have no money to pay salaries to their managers. Second, customers see no cars and go to the competitors. By that, the brand credibility gets worse and demand for cars falls. On the other hand, sales of the all suppliers drop as such. They also have either to slow down their facility, not pay salary to their workers and fire them, and so on and so forth, or to produce the stock. But for that, they need capital they don't have because there are no sales. And that stagnancy, even on one of the links of the assembly lines, just kills all the system right away. And recovering later all the work of all the companies would be tremendously hard. Think for a second about it. If UAW really had such a mighty tool, such a business leverage, would they use it in their own personal interests? No, of course not, obviously. Just for the sake of workers, that's it. The world peace is important, equality matters. Oh, sorry, here's my Rolls Royce, I'm out of here. The only one who realized what happened was Ford, because he knew about sociology and politics much more than all other car manufacturers. There was a very funny guy in his board, Harry Herbert Bennett. Shit, that's a name for a real gangster, you know? Actually, he was like the Veluyev, only smart, that's analog. He was a boxer and naval sailor too. In the board, he was responsible for security of all the plants, companies, and so on. He was like Ford security. Like, hey you, I'll kick your ass, and he was in the board. There is a funny fact about this person. As befits a real crazy military man, he was paranoid. He always thought someone could watch him, attack and kill him. Look at the house he built for himself in Michigan on a lost, isolated lake. It was an actual, unassailable fortress. The whole house was surrounded by a pit with sharpened wooden stakes. The only road to the house led across the bridge with explosives inside, not just in case. On the roof, there was a tower with a guard shack. There were armed guards permanently in there. In case of an attack, there was a secret staircase that led into the underground shelter. It led to the lake. You could cross it with a boat and disappear. The staircase had different spaces between steps so that Bennett's pursuers could have every chance to break the legs in the dark. And Bennett himself trained constantly by running that staircase up and down to remember every space. And that man with perfect mental health was the head of Ford Security. Do you remember the Hunger March? I spoke about it a bit before when police and security shot the workers. There was the operation Harry was the head of. He had the power, the authority. Ford personally gave to him. To scare, to threaten, to fire and even to beat any employee who, in secret or in public, would approve any ideas of unions, socialism, and all of that. As soon as anyone mentioned something about their rights, they were hit. But Ford's workers were the most well-warranted ones, with insurance, with healthcare and all. Just so you know, I'm messing with you right now, but Ford's workers had very cool conditions and terms. Chrysler fell down in front of UAW, and the only one remaining was Ford. And he became the main target, but his plans were organized so tight and well that no agitator could possibly sneak out there. Plus, all the workers valued their places. In some way or another, they understood that it could be worse. Others had lesser payments and harder billing. UAW couldn't help. Eventually, Vityok thought of a brilliant stint. With PR, marketing, and etc. He gathered a bunch of journalists, his brother, some more people, and with this lot, he came to the front gate of Ford River Rush complex. There was the largest plant in the world at that moment that belonged to Ford. It was the largest technological machine. And they began to spread leaflets that read, "Unionism, not Fordism." I don't know how to translate it, but you get the point. Technically, he and his lot didn't break any rules, so because of that no one heard them. Harry Bennett and his boys were standing still near the gate. Nothing was happening beside leaflets. And Vityok saw no fever pitch. Nothing was happening. Those guys were standing still, but they were journalists, photographers, something had to be done. He took 3 leaders of UAW and began to force his way. They had a bridge out there, and he tried to climb on that bridge. And that was really not allowed. That was very bad, not good. And of course, security tried to stop him. But those guys resisted quite firmly. There was a real fight, and Vityok, with flashes of cameras and video cameras, was actually seriously beaten by security. As you can see on this photo, his ally Richard Frankenstein, yes, that guy had a funny name, he was beaten much harder. But no one remembered that. The press was always talking about Walter. Actually, that was not a big deal. They just smashed his nose. But Walter spread his bloodied rival on his white shirt and yet again strengthened his image of a man who fought for workers' rights till his last drop of blood, and he be united immediately or Ford will do that to each of you. The press gladly turned this story to a horror that Ford was a tyrann and rapist, and at night he would eat babies in basements. They carried that bullshit like a red banner to all the outlets. Of course, Ford tried every possible way to clean up from those claims logically, or something like that. But you couldn't go against the words of Forbes. Life, fortune, that shit had been hitting the fan for 4 years. They were throwing mud at Ford from all the windows. His company was bearing losses after all. And because of that, in 1941, Ford agreed to UAW's terms. UAW became the political tool at once. I have my personal opinion that rights of workers and so on came next for them. Half of their board were communists in UAW, and I think the most important ideological shit was the confrontation of communism and capitalism. Like, why do you make so much money? Well, so one had. Just so you know, workers were busy working 30 hours a week. Their shifts were not 8 hours long, but 6 hours long. And they got twice as much money. There's the market. UAW didn't deserve credit for it. It was long before. But UAW messed with each and every process they could, and they tried to screw them up somehow. For example, Walter invented one very interesting program, and he called it 30-40. It meant they needed to keep 30-hour working week for workers, but their fees had to be like for 40 hours. And at what cost? Increase their payroll for 33% for no reason? The car makers said, perhaps we could speed up the production. No way, you can't speed up anything or we'll strike. No, we just want to work as always, but to get more money for that. Thanks God it wasn't done. Well, just what do you think? Is that program normal? Do you remember they promised not to strike for 5 years? Guess how they celebrated the end of that contract? Correct, with a 113-day strike on gene plants. Okay, let's close your production for 3 months, almost for 4 months even. But you have to pay our money. or we'll strike for 5 months. As you could guess, UAW brought everyone to their heel, and if the Big Three, thanks to their large sales results, could survive and keep their heads above the water, poor Packard didn't make it. The topic began with Packard. Are you with me yet, or what? With me, somehow. Remember Packard now. First, the Bendix plant stopped for a week-long strike. That plant supplied Packard with brakes. Then it was the Briggs plant that supplied Packards with body parts. And then the whole Packard's assembly line. They sat down on their asses and they were like, we're striking and doing nothing. With the competition and serious mistakes in marketing, those strikes just hit destroying blows in the company. An agony of death, awaiting bankruptcy. Packard made a deal with Studebaker. They decided to buy the Studebaker company. At the moment of the deal, it was quite a big car maker. The united company Studebaker Packard had to become the fourth company after the Big Three and compete with them. And in general, it was pretty forward-looking. But the problem was Studebaker managers faked every record, hid their losses and their debts from Packard's managers, and instead of a chance to grow and to look forward, Packard really bought a looming giant black hole in their finances. And in 1956, the results were following. The giant Packard plant shut down. The facility became empty at once. You could say it was a symbol of nearing destruction because it was located in the city center. 40,000 people worked there at the peak of the production. And when Packard fell, that facility was unclaimed. They had a giant abandoned building in the middle of the city. First, it attracted absolutely all the illegal organizations. Let's just say there were poor people, beggars, addicts, and blah blah blah. And some people tried to rent something in plans to optimize something, but still Packard died beyond revival. And the facility is still abandoned. Today it has the very same signs, symbols, and so on. Everything I described to you before that, the whole picture began to crumble. 1956, the first blow, closing of the Packard. 1957, the world crisis of overproduction. It was a major hit. The world economy became unstable and it was bad for everyone. During 1 year, the production fell over 12% across the country in general, with higher percents in Detroit, of course, plus add the world trade crisis to that crisis. That made less commodity circulation between different countries. Any crisis was associated with job cuts, and in Detroit it was very visible. Since that year, population of Detroit began decreasing very rapidly because people stopped hiring everyone and anyone. Vice versa, workers were being fired. The streets began to be flooded with piss-poor unemployed people, and every manufacturer had to be optimized because no one wanted to share Packard's fate. The third blow, remember I told you about the flow of black people into town? Exactly in the 60s they had their circular part to play. To that moment, technically, every fifth town dweller was black. And most of them were just piss-poor people who didn't find their place in the sun or who were fired from any manufacturer. During the 60s, black people were still strongly discriminated against. That has been always a very acute question. In the US, in 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I have a dream."
We will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Back then, the movement for the rights of black people was gathering pace more and more, and given that Detroit's white population had always led a flashy lifestyle with expensive cars, celebrations, some magnificent buildings, and everything, the mercury began to rise somehow, and to that constant strikes and dispersal of those strikes by the police, and the situation in that moment became simply explosive. One match was enough so that all was set ablaze. And that match was a homeless police raid to one of Detroit's speakeasies that was called the Blind Pigs. I didn't make it out its real name. At that time, there was a curfew in the city, and it was a usual thing for the police to stagger around the neighborhoods after the curfew, like you find a bar, see 5 drunks, push them into the car, book them, and release them in a day. Everyone was used to it. But in the Blind Pigs, there were 82 people who celebrated the return of their friends from the Vietnam War. Yes, at that time there was a Vietnam War, the Cold War, and if I would tell you about that too, we had an impossible timing, to be honest. Everyone was arrested, and people didn't like it very much. In an instant, a huge crowd of gawkers gathered out there, and they didn't like that action at all, and in order to express that displeasure, they went to smash everything they saw. Chapter 9. Detroit Riot. The next day, the next morning, there were disorders and chaos all over the city. People were smashing shop windows, burning cars, plundering shops. Over 10,000 people that was among the participants in that disorder. That event is known in history as the Detroit Riot. That was the only time in the US history when the government had to use military in order to suppress the riot. They needed 8,000 soldiers, 4,500 mariners and tanks too. They moved tanks to the city just to calm people down. That's it. As a result, there were 43 dead, 407 wounded, but wounded among civilians were only 182. The rest were policemen, firefighters, and military men who tried to put out fires and to calm people down somehow, just in some way. 400 horses were burned down, 2,500 shops were plundered. And just imagine, you're a white person, a person from middle class, you wake up a Sunday morning, pour a cup of coffee, go to the window, open the curtain, and you see rioting people burning your vehicle, stealing things from the nearest shop, and meanwhile, tanks shooting at them. What kind of reaction would you have? Fuck this. That was the course of action of all the sane population. That was an outflow of the financially solid and, most important, educated population. Everyone was leaving the town. By the 1970s, that means just 3 years after the riot, already every second citizen in town was black. The fourth blow, competition and tied hands of the top staff of the Big Three. At that moment, everyone realized the industry had to change. Markets were falling downward with sales and demand, and the top staff of the Big Three had decisions to make right now, but UAW boycotted each and every one of them. If anything was about reorganization of production, or salary decrease, or anything, they boycotted that. UAW was already a political tool with their deputies, with their slogans and everything. The largest problem was that the UAW seriously thought they could manage business. But no, there were talented people in the board of the Big Three, but their hands were tied because no one decision could ever pass. And they didn't care that without car manufacturers, without those companies, there would be neither UAW, nor workers, no workspaces, no production, no Detroit at all. They just didn't care. If it was all right before that moment, it would be now. Everything was fine. Besides, at that point, during 70 years, while the American car making existed, they didn't have competition with other countries. They didn't know about competition with other car ideologies. Everything they knew was about competing among themselves, adding another foot of iron to the car, putting a bigger engine inside with larger volumes, calling that some kind of perfect prestige you couldn't think or even dream of. Please buy. That's all American car makers could do at that moment. And do you remember about hippies? By the 70s, these young addicted people were actually the core of the American society. They were the American middle class. They were that firm foundation all the American economy stood upon. And during 20 years, American car makers didn't hear hippies' values. They just didn't realize that those people didn't need their cars already. And right in summer 1949, 20 years before that moment, before the 70s I'm telling you about, the first Volkswagen Beetle crossed the Atlantic. Chapter 10. Germans and Japanese.
Have you ever met
Our previous video was devoted to the history of that car. If you didn't see, check it out. If you say that Volkswagen Beetle among American cars of the 50s was a mediocrity, that was really nothing. Lada Granta is nothing compared to BMW 5, there's no real need to compare them. The price was low, the power was 25 HP, and beside the price and low fuel consumption, it hadn't any competitive advantages. And no one needed those advantages in the 50s. Gentle reminder, if your car consumed less than 20 liters per 100, you weren't an efficient and pragmatic person, but a poor beggar. And in the first year, they sold... Huh? Any ideas? How many? The great vehicle of Hitler, the most popular vehicle in the world that changed the car industry forever. How many of them were sold? 2. Not 2,000. 2. 2 Beetles only in 1949. Who was that hero, that sales manager? Just look here, you have 2 opportunities to eat in a year. You see money 2 times a year. And people take it to the money office, not to you. Besides, during their whole existence, the big 3 never thought that people might need small vehicles, like actually need them. Just in general, to ride with their wives, to move around the city or anything, they couldn't imagine that. They just thought everyone needed giant jeeps only. There was a demand for little cars. But Beetle's problem was that no one wanted to buy Hitler's car. Because there was still a want of the World War II in people's minds. It was there and no one just wanted to be associated with that. But after 5 years of brilliant marketing, Volkswagen managed to break that idea in people's heads, and sales began to increase. And in 1955, Volkswagen opened their assembly shop in the USA. And in 1959, the sales totaled as much as 120,000 cars a year. A 5-year-old Beetle on the secondary market. And a big 5-year-old Chevrolet sedan had the same price. But originally, a Chevrolet sedan's price was twice as much. And I have always said, and will say, prices on the secondary market are the most objective sign of reliability, relevance, and coolness of a car as it is. Although everyone bought new Chevrolets, the secondary market sorted everything out, and a Beetle and a bath tube from Chevrolet had the same price. And even at that time, when no one wanted to buy a Beetle, and Volkswagen didn't matter as a brand, even then Americans were falling faster in value than Germans. Another reason for that was the fact that they were throwaway. Today you'll tell cars are single use, what a nightmare, you buy it to throw away. That was invented in the 50s in the USA when demand for vehicles was simply impossible. Every year or 2 it was necessary to buy a new vehicle model. That's why they were very single use. They were botched, unreliable, with parts of high cost. And at that moment, when you could already see Beetle sales, in the 1960s, the big 3 began to get just a little bit nervous, and their answer was that thing: Chevrolet Corvair, the cheapest Chevrolet model at that time. By Beetle's example, they made that car rear-engined model. With a Boxer engine 2 and 3, or 2 and 7, there were several options. As you could have guessed, some hastily designed vehicle that was built by American workers who got very lazy worked in Volkswagen's favor. The Beetle was objectively better. Although it was several years older, it was better, and besides, as soon as Corvair left the assembly line, it turned out it was turning over. For some reasons, the engineer didn't think that anyone would drive this car. It turned over on highways very easily, and even the additional stabilizer bar during the restyling didn't solve the problem. They couldn't fool people even with propaganda of Time and Motor Trend magazines. They called Corvair just a freaking brilliant engineering idea. Best of the best. It was named the car of the year. It received a bunch of awards, but after 10 years of its existence, its total sales were 200,000 cars. In the beginning of the 60s, the Beetle sales were already 100,000 cars a year. Americans sucked. And in 1969, that old sum was 550,000 Volkswagen Beetles at all. How pleasant it is to say that Volkswagen is hot. But even though the sales were really large, Volkswagen alone couldn't turn things over. While Volkswagen drew attention of the big three, there were some sudden sneaking from behind. Those were very angry and very hungry Toyota, Mazda, Honda, and Nissan. In the year 1957, this mediocrity appeared in the USA. Toyota Toypet Crown was the first Japanese car that came out to the US market. Japanese choose the way of copying American vehicles, just like the Chinese began to copy Japanese cars in the 2000s. At their time, the Japanese copied the Americans. As a matter of fact, they made fake American vehicles, but very much worse, much uglier, and much cheaper. And when Japanese cars for the first time appeared at the US market, they left people only perplexed. Like, how could you call it a vehicle anyway? Like, at all. Just so you know, here is an example. Toyota Crown couldn't ride on the most of the American highways. It wasn't able. Why? Because they had elevation changes, and up the hill it couldn't go because its engine was very weak, and going up the hill it just didn't make it and overheated. Besides, that Toyota Crown cost more than Beetle by a third. And Beetle could go anywhere, it was light, small, it had enough engine, and it didn't overheat at all. Well, Volkswagen Land Cruiser 25BG also wasn't needed by anyone in the hippie land. It was a paramilitary car, in the land of peace and flowers. 50 cars were sold a year, not thousands, cars. Like, how many was that? 4 cars a month, 1 a week. Japanese conquered Americans, but everything changed in the year 1964. It was the birth year of Toyota Corona third generation. And beginning with that car, you could say that the Japanese realized what European and American consumers needed. An air conditioner was installed, its transmission was Toyo Glide, and its design was developed by Battista Farina, an Italian designer. Just so you know, he was one of the founders of such unheard-of agency like Pininfarina. His showpiece was the original design of Alfa Romeo Spider. That car you see. It was built only 2 years later than the Corona, and you should know that the Japanese always did some offbeat and very original advertising for their vehicles. In case of Corona, they organized a test ride when the car had to ride 100,000 kilometers by speed of 140 kilometers per hour on the Michelin Expressway. And the car made it without any breakdowns. For 1964, it was just out of your mind when your cheap car with automatic transmission and air conditioner didn't break over 100,000 kilometers. It was like, what? How's that possible? Any American from the 60s would fall apart without reaching that highway, as the half of the modern ones. And that worked. People began to buy Toyotas. And further on, inch by inch, they began to size the market. It was the Toyota 2000 GT that was filmed in the James Bond movie. That was an ad, too. I won't open any of you a secret that was another ad, will I? All the movies with cars, those are ads. It's all prepared. You're no children. That was Toyota Corolla Generation 1, and by 1969 the total sales of Toyota were 100,000 cars a year. Concurrently, a company no one knew about and no one needed, named Honda, launched its Model S500, and suddenly it won the first place at Nuremberg, the 600-kilometer long race. Once more, 600 kilometers, Nuremberg, the first Honda, really unknown before that, and 1966 was the birth year of the S800 that nailed Formula 2 race 11 times in a row. Not for all the time, 11. Honda's hallmarks were cost-effectiveness and environmental friendliness. Those are keen today, too, actually, but back then nobody needed that. Nevertheless, at that time, Honda sold the smallest and the most powerful efficient generators, and it was producing the Super Cub, which still is the most popular means of transportation in the world. It's a little motor car. James May filmed a documentary about it. It was a company doing just that, nothing else. They didn't want to make any vehicles. In 1972, they brought the first Civic to the US. The car didn't matter even, the most important thing was the CVCC engine. Why was that important? As soon as that engine appeared in the market, Ford and Chrysler already wanted the same. They realized they couldn't create something like that. With its technologies of cost effectiveness and energy efficiency, it was unachievable for the Americans, and they said, "We have to buy these engines from the Japanese." And that was exactly the moment to write a check. That was the fact. The Americans admitted that in motor building, the Japanese were really superior. Of course, they tried to create something competitive, but all their attempts were really screwed up and all. Like Ford Pinto, Ford Maverick, Chevrolet Vega, AMC Gremlin. Gremlin. They called it Gremlin. Like, that would be our answer to the Japanese, our bomb. Gremlin. Like, go buy it. What? It was a strange behavior even in the 70s. And all their answers, considering that the Japanese and Volkswagen Beetle were oh so weird. In the year 1973, the last giant nail was driven into the coffin of Detroit. The oil crisis. Chapter 11. The oil crisis and UAW answer. On 17th of October, all the Arabian OPEC members, like Egypt, Syria, and so on, stopped selling oil to the USA and some other countries. Oil rose in price, and there were problems with supplies. And in one day, the cult of V8 was ruined because prices for gas steeped, and there was a shortage of Eden gas stations. And at some point, there was a rule that some gas stations worked only on Tuesday. This isn't my meme, it's a fact. So you could fill up the tank once a week. In no time, American cars became worthless and no one wanted them. And the cost of their maintenance, just of simple use, went up to space. And with all of that, the Japanese and the Germans, who had been working for 10 years to make the most cost-efficient and reliable vehicle, became superior. Really unchallenged. What do you think the guys from UAW did? Well, maybe they were business movers, they understood everything, they cared about workers and everything, so they just had jobs, workspaces. Perhaps they locked themselves in their offices to design a new vehicle, to create such a thing that would definitely kill the Germans and Japanese with one move. Or perhaps they began to think about the production efficiency, improving the assembly line, lowering production costs. Yeah, right. Instead of gathering together, negotiating, freaking thinking, and making something good, they began to sponsor anti-Japanese movements. They began to purchase Japanese vehicles. Just think about it, please. They began to purchase Japanese vehicles to exhibit them at town holidays, at parades. And they gave anybody who wanted to a Hummer and a chance to crash the car. It's not a joke. Crowds were gathering around a poor Corolla or something like that. They received a Hummer and they went to smash a Japanese freaking vehicle. Competition, like a brilliant engineering decision. Let's tear them up, guys, really? And that was all UAW was capable of, just the big three under the rule of those unions. New technologies, new marketing strategy? No, take a Hummer and smash a Toyota. The fired workers were told, obviously, that they were fired not because their top staff were worthless and stupid, but because it was the Japanese fault. The global conspiracy. The Japanese came and mercilessly ruined our economy. There was another smart and tactical decision. Those workers who stayed on their plants received strikers for their car bumpers with inscriptions Nissan, Toyota, Pearl Harbor. Like a reference to that ship, to that battle. It was very emblematic that I found an example of that striker on that rusty Ford. It was very funny and very stupid, and how those decisions were taken seriously, I don't know. I just can't imagine the top staff really. Well, how did it look like? They were just a round table and they were strikers. First we smashed Corolla, now the strikers for bumpers. Excellent. It was enough that idiots from UAW sponsored those movements and stoked ethnic discord. They got every support from echelons of power. There was that dude, Lee Iacocca. He was the CEO of Chrysler at that time. And at a meeting with the House of Representatives, he joked about the Japanese question like, what if we throw that more atomic bombs in Japan? Haha, very funny. 450,000 human lives are perfect jokes. He was hilarious, yeah. And of course, considering all this propaganda, having a Japanese car was pretty dangerous. But it was far more dangerous to have a Japanese face. And it was very sad, but the high point of that situation was the murder of Vincent. There was that guy in the year 1982. Chapter 12. Vincent. Vincent and his friends celebrated a bachelor party before his wedding. He had a wedding day the next day. Unfortunately for him, Ronald Yebbins was also in that bar that night. I didn't make it up. Ronald Yebbins and his stepson, Michael someone, it doesn't matter. The stepson was fired from Chrysler, and Yebbins was still someone of the top stuff. He was some plant supervisor. And at some point, those guys, two people who were just hammered, they looked and there stood Vincent. And like, that was the reason of the defeat of the American car industry and the reason the stepson was fired and their salary was less. There he was, the reason of that. And there was a fight. And as a result, Vincent Chen died in a hospital in a few days. The irony was that Vincent was Chinese. That man died because UAW fools and the top staff declared that they didn't mess up, but the Chinese. And if you had a Japanese vehicle at that time, it was perfectly normal if you went up to it in the morning and it had broken glasses, for example, or punctured tires. It could be stolen, burned, smashed, and so on. And not because you were a bad person, you just bought the wrong vehicle. And in 1981, when the sales in total of Japanese cars were pretty darn high, to be honest, the American government got very nervous about it and wondered what they could do. And they imposed a legislative rule that the amount of cars imported to the United States couldn't be more than 1,680,000. In that way, they thought to limit the sales volume in order to stop a field for their own for the big three. Does any of you remember that phrase, "What's good for General Motors, it's good for America"? Using that slogan, they were cleaning the market. But Honda said, oh my god, LOL, and in 1983 they opened a plant in Ohio, not far from Detroit. They just built it whole, like if we can't import it, we'll build it right here. The thing was, the Japanese didn't have UAW. Their workers worked in Japanese terms, and they had very strict rules, legitimate but strict. There is some stuff for another video, but I'm telling you something here. For example, all the Japanese car companies worked by military laws. The rules were very strict, just that they are now strict with ranks and everything. We'll talk about it in the video about Japan. 2 years later, after the Honda plant opened in Ohio, the Toyota plant opened too, where they built Corollas. 2 years after that, there was the plant building engines for Camry. They built engines for Camry, and they began to build Camry in USA. Chapter 13. Defeat. In 1990, when Detroit was lost part recovery, the bestseller car in the United States was Honda Accord. And the total sales of Japanese cars were over 3 million vehicles. That was totally unachievable amount for American car makers at that time. And the higher amounts of sales of Japanese cars were, the more screwed up Detroit was. Instead of being the capital of prestige and development of car industry, it was the capital of drug traffic, murder, and arsons. Did you watch the RoboCop? Not the modern one that was launched recently, but the right one, with Weller playing the leading role 1987. Do you remember the vibes of the movie? It was filmed in Detroit. During that times, that was the end of the 1980s. Of course, it told about the future, something like our time now, but the whole picture and the general situation looked like they really were. And look at the irony. Right now, in the year 2019, even Hyundai Kia which began by copying off vehicles of Toyota, has larger total sales than American companies. Here's the statistics from Bloomberg. Volkswagen is a real hottie with 3 and 6. Renault, Nissan, Mitsubishi 3 and 4. Toyota 3 and 2 and Kia 2 and 4. Look how much GM differs from the first place and Toyota. 2 and 15. That's a wide margin. And then there's Ford and Fiat Chrysler. All those numbers show us one thing. The era of American car making was over. Or rather, the era of the American car empire was over. They produce something still nowadays, but not on that scale as their competitors produce vehicles. They're holding debates what the reason of Detroit's fall was. A race question, or unions, or oil crisis, or wrong ruling of the city. There are a lot. But I'm an automobilist, and like the man who was digging in archives and sources for 3 weeks searching for various historic materials, I believe that the center of that storm was rather the Japanese and German small cars. Or rather, not the cars, but the inability of American companies and American management to compete with them. After 20 years of thriving success, they lost any touch with the market and were out of control by the early 70s. Could the Americans return as leaders of car industry? Yeah, of course. Could Detroit be reborn? It's possible. But by 2013, Detroit had so many massive debts that was the only time anywhere at any point in human history when a city was bankrupt. Yeah, it was a very sad situation. But that was the only way for the Americans and the rulers of the city to receive it, just at some level. Only the center is alive now in Detroit. There are building offices out there so that it could be the center of design, arts, music, and all that modern trends. Although there is some life in the city center, the rest of Detroit, all the residential communities represent a desert from abandoned houses. God grant if one person lives around the whole neighborhood. Japanese have won that war nonetheless despite losing the World War II, despite their huge amount of human losses during nuclear bombardments and military actions, and they still managed to build their car industry from the scratch to restore it and to defeat the American companies. In our next historical video, we'll find out how the country like Japan could lose 4 million people captive and killed, lose all its money and resources, be isolated with sanctions, and 13 years later become a leader of the world motor vehicle industry. Thank you if you have watched this video to the end. We have never filmed such complicated materials with regards to script, writing and editing. That's why your feedback is very important to us. If you liked it, be sure to share it on your social media, give it a link to your friends and WhatsApp and so on and so forth. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye.